Hi, this is Paul, and I have a very special conversation today with two Michaels. I'm not sure how we'll get all the Michaels straight. Maybe it's one Mike and one Michael, but a number of you noticed last week I put a conversation on my channel. I very rarely do this, that I don't participate in, but that was in anticipation of this conversation because I thought, I really, so Michael L is the guy below here. And you've seen him on the channel before. He's been on the channel a number of times. He's on quite a bit with on the Meaning Code with Karen. And if you're not subscribed to Karen's channel and following their conversations on the Meaning Code, to me, some of those are some of the best, just slow, thoughtful, working through things carefully conversations. Karen lives not too far from me in Northern California, and so she and I exchange notes fairly often. And of course, Michael's been around. And Michael invited this other Michael. Now, how do you say your last name?
Well, it's Americanized to Diffusia. Most people just say Diffusia. That's how my family pronounces it. Yeah.
Okay. And you've written a book on Owen Barfield.
Yes.
That was your you got that on the way to your PhD in philosophy.
It was I suppose it would be philosophical theology, but the degree is in theology. Yeah. So okay. PhD in theology. Yes. It was my PhD thesis.
Okay.
Well, it was done in England, but they say thesis over there. It'd be dissertation in the US.
Okay.
It's the same thing.
Okay. And actually, I think a while ago in a conversation I was having with John Vervaeke, I don't know if you're very familiar with him. Michael.
Through Michael, yeah. I've learned a bit about him, yeah.
He'll probably want to have a conversation with you at some point too, I would imagine, after this one. Because I believe it was your book that he held up to me when I was talking to him about Barfield. He said, I'm interested in this book. I believe it's that. I just caught it out of my eye. So he would be someone who would be interesting to talk to for you, I think. Michael, I want to go down to Michael L first and say he was the one who sort of put this together. And part of the reason I hesitate in having conversations with people whose book I haven't read, whose work I don't know. It's because it's hard to, even if you're going to do a 2-hour conversation, it's hard to sort of find each other if you're not terribly familiar with each other's work. And so Michael L is really the one who put us together, because Michael's been following my work and Michael's been in conversation with you. So Michael, why did you put this together, and where can we sort of begin?
Yeah, I mean, for me, obviously, I've been really obsessed with Barfield. I know he's something that's come up for you in your conversations as well over the past few years. But I see, in terms of your project, one of the things that seems to fascinate you is this sort of division between the secular and the sacred, and how that kind of came to be and sort of instantiated both in the church and how we think, but also more broadly in American culture and in the West. And it feels to me like Barfield almost kind of predicts that before it happens. And I mean, he kind of sees the manifestations of it very early on and kind of points to where this is all going. So I felt like there was a nice overlap there in terms of, some of your conceptions of God number one and God number two, the secular sacred divide, and some of the work I feel like Mike Diffusia does a really good job in the book of kind of elaborating not only what Barfield kind of points to in terms of what his project and his work, but also kind of what is left out of it, which is some more of the theological side of things as well that I think you use and take up as in terms of explaining a lot of this.
Okay. Now, part of the reason I put the other conversation on my channel was, some of the real ardent watchers of my channel will have watched that just because I posted it. And so I didn't want to do too much biography of either of you or Barfield in this, although we'll have to do some. Barfield was a close friend of C.S. Lewis. He was, Lewis called him his second friend. Mike and Michael. Mike, where did you, in that video that you did with Michael, you sort of walked through some of your Christian faith and what you bumped into. And what about Barfield? I mean, because it's very, in our space, it's very common for people to run into Lewis, and Lewis will be a very regular stop for a lot of people, either in terms of finding faith or, let's say, halting secularized deconstruction, or just trying to, you know, bring, if you were raised in the church, bring your intellectual credibility up to speed. So Lewis is a very regular stop, but Barfield, especially, I mean, partly because of his association with Rudolf Steiner, you know, Barfield is a far less regular stop. So why Barfield for you?
Well, to be honest, I had never heard, of course, I'd read C.S. Lewis. I went to do a PhD in England, and I had never heard of Owen Barfield until 8 months into my PhD. So that came as by way of suggestion by my doctoral supervisor, John Milbank, because he was seeing, which John does so well, he was seeing a lot of threads I was trying to weave in Barfield's work. And that gave me a project that was doable for me. That's the short answer of very straightforward, practically how I ended up studying Owen Barfield. What I was interested in, I suppose, was that I had just come out of kind of a context that was quite conservative in the sense of the way that one would read the Bible, politically conservative, bordering on a sort of fundamentalism. And I had become kind of disillusioned with that because it didn't work for me in a sense. Like it, my interior world seemed to be eroding. I shared a bit of this on the thing with Michael, so I'm not going to go entirely into it. And so I suppose I came to a moment of a faith crisis where I realized all of my Christianity was based on a God that I had kind of constructed and those around me had constructed. It had little to do with faith. It had little to do with grace. And it was, and so what I was looking for was a sort of more robust form, I suppose, of Christianity that would, a God that really did pervade not just my own personal space, but all of reality. And I felt that if God couldn't do that, or that wasn't God, then the God I was holding and clinging to could never stand up. I wanted something a bit more robust. And so I'd gone into my PhD thesis. I had just started to I finished a master's degree, and it just towards the end of it been exposed to more like high Anglican Catholic thought, and that started to stir in me this deeper well, I suppose, of what was in the Christian tradition. And one of the things that was quite popular, you'll remember this, is people started meeting in coffee shops, and Starbucks became really popular, and this idea of community. People wanted to be communal. And so what I was experiencing, at least, was in the kind of evangelical charismatic world that I came out of, was everyone had this hyper spiritual connection to God, right? And it was kind of a individual thing, but then there was this move, at least in the circles I was in, that like God would be seen within community and things like this as well. And so I was trying to, I suppose, when I went to do my PhD, overcome, on the one hand, the kind of dualistic thinking that I was dealing with, the sacred, profane thing that I sensed. God was here, he wasn't there, he was in me, he may not be outside of me, on the one hand. And then on the other hand, trying to link how it is that the way I relate to God should also be the way in which I relate to reality around me. So some people would use the term horizontal and vertical, like what was the kind of link between these? And it was John's work that really put me onto that. But really, any robust theology is always talking about that. It always is. But I had never been exposed to it. And so when John heard that I was doing this, I shared a bit of this on Michael's, the Meaning Code. he had seen these kind of links and knew what I was trying to do. He said, well, Adrian Paps, a former student of his, is writing this right now. He's almost done with it. And it's called Metaphysics, the Creation of Hierarchy. It's an incredible book. It came out a couple years ago, but this would have been, he was still writing it when I was doing my PhD. Absolutely brilliant. He did what I couldn't do and still couldn't do. But Owen Barfield was a manageable project for me. And he was linking in some ways the way in which we encounter reality, the way in which things are more interconnected than we tend to think they are. He does eventually get to this more robust vision of God, but not much. He's not very theological, but it gave me something to focus on. So that's the long answer that has a bit to do with my own Christian history as well.
Okay. Now it's interesting how you talked about the inside and outside, because if you've read any Barfield or know anything about his work, right there, we're already starting to dive into it. And it's also very interesting. Just last week on Friday, associated with my channel is a Discord server, which is sort of a computer chat facility that gamers used, and my local meetup has sort of extrapolated it into a conversation space around the kinds of issues that we're talking about. And we did a conversation on basically about the charismatic movement. It was very interesting. I noticed that Michael's got an icon behind him now. So this is starting to come together, because where the conversation went, which was interesting to me, I didn't anticipate it, was sort of a meeting of the charismatic tradition and the Orthodox tradition, especially spearheaded. I know you two talked about it a little bit in the previous conversation, the work by Jonathan Pajot and symbolism. And, I know Barfield, the Orthodox tend to be pretty conservative by just about every measure. And so Barfield would in some ways be sort of outside, sort of outside their realm. But this question of inside and outside is really critical. I think especially, I didn't grow up in a Pentecostal tradition. I grew up in a Dutch Reformed tradition. But in my college years, I attended a church that had grown out of a 1960s, 70s, these things get weird in America, sort of a Dutch Reformed, communal, charismatic group that didn't really hold together. And some of the refugees of that went on to sort of colonize an inner city church, because I had grown up in Patterson. My ethos had very much been inner city ministry. I went into that church, and then that church then sort of exposed me to some more charismatic practice and charismatic culture. And so it's very interesting the way these things sort of come together, especially around a guy like Barfield. And this is sort of where Steiner comes into this conversation, because how to characterize Steiner, you have sort of romanticism coming in, and romanticism is trying to deal with let's call it the inhumanity of modernity. And so I don't know. It's just, I'm seeing some of these pieces, at least for the sake of this conversation, start to come together. Michael, you need to butt in wherever you want to. I'm from New Jersey, and all this stuff about waiting for people to stop talking, that just doesn't work. So just butt in if you want to butt in, please. Because I get a sense from Mike that he's a talker too. So if you're too polite, you're not going to get your licks in.
Yeah. Well, I'll just say this. I mean, and I had sent a little note to you and Mike last night just about how I found that conversation really timely as well. Great. Are we still live? Is Paul?
I am. I don't know. Oh yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I've got you. No
okay.
problem.
Sorry. Everything went so quiet for a second. I lost. I thought I had been disconnected, but yeah, I found that conversation really timely, and was thinking about what the connection there is, and it does seem to me that one of the, like you mentioned, romanticism coming in to try and, in some sense, re-enchant reality, which has been kind of stripped of it by the modern gaze. And it seems it's like Barfield, I feel like, does offer kind of an alternate method of seeing that re-enchantment, not in a sort of as you would maybe term it, a God number two that you can command to the stage to do signs and wonders, but actually at a deeper kind of God number one level of like the structure of reality suddenly coming alive and being imbued with this almost like a sort of magical power, which we can interact with and understand just by paying more careful attention to language and the way certain words come alive when we use them, in things like poetry and literature and the arts. And then also in terms of just consciousness itself, that there is this sort of interiority of that can be explored that's really, really deep. And these are sort of alternate ways of kind of reimagining God's interaction with us, and he's kind of caring in his love for us, even, I think. And I think that because there's something that was a theme in the conversation on Friday, that was really, there was this real desire for wanting to know that God is involved and really cares and is watching.
Yes. Mike, you mentioned, and this really struck me in your conversation with Michael, that again I posted on my channel last week. You said, I was a fundamentalist, and so I was already a rationalist. And for a lot of the people who have come to this conversation through my channel, through Jordan Peterson, and before Jordan Peterson, through Sam Harris, that might seem like an oxymoron. And that also connects into Pentecostalism deeply, because, I mean, Pentecostalism, when I first started to try to come to terms philosophically, what's really going on with these charismatics? It was immediately apparent this is a reaction against modernity. But as we saw with fundamentalism, they were already deeply modern in their reaction against. So could you flesh out some of these links?
Yeah, I think it's helpful historically to think in terms of romanticism and where it emerges, to make sense of, for me, where this idea that I suppose I said something, and I still stand by that being a fundamentalist meant that I was a rationalist, but being a charismatic also meant that as well. And when the Enlightenment unfolds with Kant's writing, without going into great detail, one of the things that the reactionaries against Kant, who come to be known as romantics, but they're also philosophers, has to do with the fact that he sunders the heart and the mind, probably. That's probably the easiest way. He does this in the third critique without going into detail. And the reaction against him has to do with not the idea that the world should be re-enchanted, because by the time of Kant, this has already been well undone, but there was what I would call like an alternative modernity that exists, which Adrian Paps traces very well in his metaphysics work, in that these reactionaries against Kant are picking up on and kind of just continuing in that stream. And what they're concerned with is this separation between, again, the easiest way to describe it would be the heart, the effectiveness, that feeling in the mind. And there's much more philosophy behind this and aesthetics and all that. But that's the simplest way of putting it. So by the time of someone like Coleridge and the Romantic movement in England, which is birthed out of these reactionaries in Germany, you get, by then, materialism and empiricism has really taken hold, which means the only thing that's real is material stuff. And so when someone like Coleridge is writing, and any of the romantics, there's a feeling that what's actually taking place is, oh, these people just want to feel good and write poetry, and it has no connection to reality any longer because that job has already been done. It unfolded over centuries. So now we think in terms of a poet or the Romantics as someone who's kind of, disconnected from reality, right? But if Coleridge was absolutely brilliant. That's not at all what he was doing. He was just simply saying, no, reality actually consists in something like subjectivity and objectivity being held together. So if you fast forward all the way to our contemporary period in what you're describing, the idea of rationalism, on the one hand, you have people who want to be very objective about the faith, and that tends to be the tradition I grew up in. And then there might be a reaction to that it really is a real reaction that, wow, I don't, this isn't working. There's this heart part of me that wants to experience God and all that. And so it's kind of like the inverse of that. And so it's tricky because a lot of, although it's changing right now, in my experience with charismatic or Pentecostal theologians, initially, there's more increasingly. What was happening was we were bringing this very rationalistic reading of the Bible into that world. And there was kind of this cognitive dissonance. Like, how do we do with this evangelical attempt for truth, but yet be charismatic and have this effective side of us? Like, how do we marry these two things together without throwing the baby out with the bathwater? I think more recently in some writers in the charismatic stream are looking at biblical interpretation differently. Now they're moving away from the historical critical method. They're seeing it's important, but they're returning to something like spiritual exegesis and things like that, because that tends to align with that. So I think as it develops, at least, again, I'm no expert in charismatic or Pentecostal theology, but the writing I'm familiar with is having to try to bring that more, I suppose, marry those two visions, if you like, rather than kind of going from one to the other. But as long as one is flipping from back and forth, we're all children of modernity or the Enlightenment in that way, if that makes sense. But Romanticism proper does not do that, is what I would want to say. Okay. And this is where Barfield fits in. I think this is what your these inner outer, there's a kind of tension that you hold there. You don't flip, we don't divide them. Everything is kind of a tension between those, what we might call mind and heart, I suppose.
Yeah. Now, Michael, you read through Lewis and Barfield's Great War. What did Lewis learn from Barfield in this space, do you think?
Yeah, I think
you're asking Michael, right?
Oh, Michael. Yes. Yeah, this is a Mike and Michael thing.
Yeah. I guess I'll answer first, and you can reflect afterwards, Mike. I think Lewis would not have been the person we know and read about without his interactions with Barfield. But I think the kind of seeds he sowed in that conversation were really rather deep. And one of the, obviously, Lewis later explicitly says that one of the things Barfield does for him is he cures his chronological snobbery. This idea, again, it's the sort of modern vision that we're progressing towards our own salvation through this sort of rationalistic discovery of the universe, and that what's newer is necessarily better. And Barfield's able to really expose to him kind of all these lost riches in the past, where suddenly, Lewis is able now to become a medieval scholar that, really revels in these old works and sees this kind of magic and mystery in them, even as a rationalist himself. And in some sense, I feel like Lewis never kind of completely gets away from it, but he still finds such a joy and pleasure in those things that he's now able to I think he struggled with this. He struggled to see that sense of, he used that word Sehnsucht, or which is like that German word of sort of longing and joy, that he wasn't able to really necessarily even internalize that as a connection with truth initially. And over his life, he kind of is slowly able to expand and see that more and more is its source in function is to draw him to God. And then, I'll just make one other observation, which was, I think this was in the author of that book, he mentions that in a certain sense, what Lewis was more of a his preference was to be a noun user, and Barfield, his preference was to be a verb user. And kind of the big distinction between those two is like in a verb, you have time and development. You have a sort of unfolding of reality versus the modern attempt to kind of pin things down into a static frame that you can kind of freeze frame everything and get it down to a way in which you could solve for all the, put all the puzzle pieces together, so to speak. Whereas Barfield sees this unfolding complexity to reality that kind of, I think Lewis in some sense can't deny, but also he doesn't like what it does to his nice kind of clean lines of how things lay themselves out.
That sort of maps on Jordan Peterson's beginning of Maps of Meaning, where the world can be construed in two ways: as a place of objects or a form for action. Your form for action is your verb, and your objects are obviously your nouns. So I think that's helpful. One of the things that really fascinates me about Barfield is this, initial participation, this loss of participation, and then final participation, and how. So of course I come at this from a Dutch Reformed perspective, and I know you're who Jamie Smith is, and some conversant with some of his work. He of course comes into the Calvin College Dutch Reformed community from Pentecostalism, which is sort of an interesting thing. But of course my tradition is creation, fall, redemption, restoration. Sort of map that onto Barfield, and one of the things that I was thinking about when I was listening to the conversation between you two twice. One of the things that I see coming up regularly is the trying to assess and evaluate this loss of participation and the value of it. And I noticed, Mike, in your defense of your dissertation, you guys got into techne a little bit. And, Michael, you mentioned, probably because I've been, playing with Wilfrid Sellers, the, scientific vision and the manifest vision, and, kind of conceiving those as one eye versus another eye. I mean, part of what the scientific vision is close one eye and say, okay, let's live as if there is no final purpose. You get all of that purpose out of the system, so you can just look at. And I also noticed you were looking at Aristotle's physics, physis, which is, of course, Lewis picks up on miracles. So it's interesting where this comes through, where you have this original participation, this, in a sense, let's call it primordial innocence of wind, both in Greek and Hebrew. Ruach or pneuma is, two things together. We sort of split it apart in terms of, and in that splitting it apart, we get to wield matter like a creator. We get to form matter. We, of course, bring in our purpose to it. And that's what, in a sense, the divorce from participation affords us. But it seems at the end of modernity and the problems of modernity, we come to a point where we realize it has to be reintegrated to finally achieve the original telos, the original purpose for which it was made. And in that sense, we sort of become sub-creators in this. I don't want to necessarily use the word fall, but again, with our mappings, it kind of takes this on, and then in final participation, I'm thinking sort of through Lewis's book Miracles, which has been a book that I've sort of tracked through my video odyssey over the last 3 years. I don't know. So Mike, where has sort of the mapping of Barfield's loss of participation sort of come into this more Western theological tradition for you in terms of assessment?
That's a great question, and you described the way that he thinks in a very articulate way. So you're obviously reading him and tracking very well. Part of me wants to say, on the one hand, it has nothing to do with theology because he doesn't really write so much that way. But then again, Steiner's entire I suppose cosmology is based on the incarnation. So I just can't get around that. How I would describe it in terms of, I would describe it more in terms of a word we use now is like a genealogy, like how we got where we are. I think of it in those ways. And so Charles Taylor, for example, A Secular Age, I would compare that kind of unfolding. It almost maps onto the way that someone like Charles Taylor would account for the rise of kind of secularism in where we are today. And then something like After Virtue with Alistair McIntyre, it's not unlike that either in a lot of the ways that you're describing purposes and teleology. That has to do with what Alistair McIntyre is talking about, how we got where we are today. And then I would want to look at it more in terms for Barfield. It's tricky. I've had a conversation with Michael about this as to whether for Barfield it was just a matter of perception, the way that we view reality, that he's tracking. Most of Barfield's work is just touching upon that. I tend to read it more as a cosmology, though. I think there's more to it. I think for him, there's an actual like ontological shift that's occurring, and you can't quite track whether he thinks reality is actually shifting through this cosmology or it's just perception that's changing. That's tricky to, in fact, I wouldn't make a claim one way or the other for him, but I think both have to be read that way. So just to describe it very easily, you have this original participation, like you mentioned, where the easiest way to describe this would be like where form and matter or supernatural and natural kind of are held together. And for him, he sees this in like primitives, like everything is alive to them, right? So that's a picture of the past. And then he blames Aristotle. Barfield blames Aristotle. You start to get this alpha thinking period. He calls exactly what you're saying, where there's a separation of this sort of supernature essences or of meaning from matter. And so matter takes on its own kind of thing. And then humans, where's the meaning go? Well, it's just in our mind. So now this is the alpha thinking period. So like you say, exactly what you said, we can then read meaning into reality. So we have this separation. This meaning somehow goes into our minds. Of course, with really crude materialism, there's no such thing as even a mind, but most people don't believe that. And then now Barfield seems to be saying that down the road, we're going to try to marry these kind of this more analytic, abstract mind that we developed with this more older or more original participation. He calls that a kind of final participation. And I think in some ways, even with our discussion with the charismatic kind of fundamentalist, shifting, you can see that attempt in at least like in existential ways, people trying to work that out.
Well, go ahead, Michael, if you want to get in there.
Yeah, I was just going to say real quickly, one of the things Barfield does, because his initial foray into all this is an investigation of language, and that's really, he comes out of the First World War himself kind of an atheist and kind of in the throes of that, but then he finds in interactions with language, he finds a certain, let's just call it magic for back a word, something that alters his consciousness to such a degree that he's like, I can't ignore this. And so he writes this book, it's his first book, History in English Words, and he just traces these changes in language. And one of the things I think that he realizes is in that process is that in some sense, language is constitutive of reality at a very deep level. And so that in terms of how we're playing that sub-creator, like how we play that role, like we've actually altered the world in some real ways by just our interactions with these languages, and how we conceive of what these words mean. They've actually, and again, I don't know, it's a great question. Is ontology, is the metaphysical reality changing, or is it just a perception thing? But it certainly has tremendous consequences, is what he points out through the unfolding of that book and into Poetic Diction.
Well, and I think this does get into in some ways the charismatic space. And I was joking in the conversation I had last Friday about Frank Peretti, I remember reading, I mean, if you've been around these spaces at all and you're old enough, you would have read Frank Peretti's. I remember when Frank Peretti's book, This Present Darkness, came out, that just sort of went whoosh through conservative Christian communities. And what's fascinating about that, thinking about Lewis in terms of Lewis's migration, like I said, I've been really, the book, Lewis's book Miracles, has been an important book for me, just to kind of, that Lewis was for me, I think, is for many kind of a helpful guide through modernity in terms of maintaining my Christianity and not sort of full-blown deconstructing into this this kind of cheap vague materialism. And then, as a pastor, I watch people do this. And I think, as you said earlier in your conversation, Mike, I mean, I know for some of our listeners, once you mention Immanuel Kant or any, any philosophy at all, eyes are going to glaze over. But if you understand what Kant and the reaction against Kant, the severing, and I like how you said it, the severing of the heart and the mind did, and you watch, just about any Christian community over the last 50 years or so, which is my lifetime, I'm in my late 50s now, you see people sort of brought up into, let's say, a Dutch Reformed tradition where it's very, on one hand, it's very European, it's very rationalistic. It is, for a couple hundred years, Christianity has been, theologians have been trying to rescue Christianity from this divide and, all sorts of both science and scientism. And so then you get this fundamentalism, but people find in their lives, they hit a wall basically where they can't live in it. And so then especially in the United States in the 70s, Jimmy Carter is born again. And Chuck Colson, who was Richard Nixon's hatchet man, finds Jesus. And there's the personal relationship, finds Jesus, comes home to his wife and says, I've become a Christian. And his wife basically says, I thought we were Episcopalian. What is the relationship between these two things? And so suddenly this personal relationship with Jesus comes to the fore. Now, again, if you're following philosophy, romanticism, all of these ideas, you wouldn't be terribly surprised to find that this evangelicalism, personal relationship, some people are going to want to turn up the heat on this personal relationship and not just have this lover that you're in love with, but you want your lover to do things for you. And so, if you read, let's say, Chuck Colson's, I think that's actually a quite important book in terms of mapping Christian history in America, because the turn is very clear with Colson, from this sort of Cold War mainline modernity flipping over into personal relationship evangelicalism. And your personal relationship is at least the beginnings of a very Pentecostal movement where now I pray to Jesus and I'm writing down my prayer requests and I expect answers to prayer. And then to see, say, Frank Peretti, now we have to somehow provide a mythology for what's happening when we pray. And so Frank Peretti comes on and we've got these angels and these demons, and now suddenly, we have a mythos to this personal relationship. And, again, I then far later, when you look at Barfield and this development of consciousness, it's like, oh yeah, stuff's moving here, boys and girls. And then of course this also tracks on to some of my other, I was a foreign missionary before I came back to North America to do this. If you're working with Haitians and Dominicans or Africans, then you're really inhabiting a different world. And so these ontological questions get very interesting. So I don't know, just throw that out and you guys will pick up on it. I know you will.
Go ahead, Michael.
Yeah, there's so much there in terms of these changes. and I guess I feel like all the things you were describing there are almost too close to home for me to have any sort of, I mean, because yeah, I grew up in a Pentecostal family, and yeah, I read all of Frank Peretti's work, as a very young child, probably like in my, I was probably like 10 or 11 or 12, when I was reading him, and that definitely formed this sort of this idea of spiritual warfare. Yeah, I don't know. It's
You guys are a generation younger, and so I was older when I read this, but you
Yeah.
guys were raised in it. And just in
Yeah.
terms of your developmental curve, that
But you
adds resonance.
you said something really interesting though. It's like, you walk down this path far enough, and then you kind of hit a wall where you can't live in it. It doesn't map closely enough onto an experience of reality. There's too many places where you're having to, suspend your disbelief to stay in that story. And it just doesn't work. And what's funny is I still, a lot, I still know, like, for instance, like my parents, they're still in that story. And I guess maybe as you get older, you have one of the weapons you have against the outside world is you're kind of, the doors of your perception of kind of narrow so much that that acts as its own kind of buffer against those sort of changes coming in. But for myself as a young person, I just, you hit a wall and you can't live it anymore. You have too many important, decisive decisions about purpose and meaning in life, coming into adulthood, that you have to, you sense the lack of a depth in terms of your ontology of the world. And I just realized at some point, I'm like, I have to think deeper about these things rather than accepting what was handed to me.
Well, and Mike, I saw your eyes light up too. I mean, you mentioned Frank Peretti, and of course, many of the people who have never grown up in a deep Christian. I mean, again, Frank Peretti's books just came on as a whoosh, and when I listen to you walk through the story, if you have an understanding of what's going on in philosophy, how that stuff trickles down into, the regular lives of people, and I think part of Jordan Peterson's contribution is recognizing that part of the ways that story, that sort of the philosophy and then the story, part of the ways that these things get into our normal life is status. Okay. And part of what, what happened in our culture transitioning from the Cold War into, so the 60s are sort of this, I mean, this is just rich history in here. And again, when I listened to you tell your story to Michael in that other video, I thought, yeah, this is the, you guys are sort of on the front end of the deconstruction that we see happening with like Rhett and Link, who are these YouTubers, with how many people in Christian bands who, they had a little music, they had exactly the right talent, and then they started going on tour with their Christian band, and they've got some name recognition, and then boop, on Instagram, I don't believe anymore, I've deconstructed, and it's like, I can see why.
Yeah, I think there's been, I think everyone kind of reaches that moment. I would say I'm a charismatic. I still consider myself charismatic. And so what I'm normally speaking of when I pass through these different, I suppose, spiritual journey, I suppose what I would call it, is that when I say that it didn't hold together, it had to do, I don't know where I got it from, but it had to do with, I suppose, not, how would I say this? Yeah, I think it just had to do with the fact that I wasn't, I didn't have resources around me or people around me who could walk me through the sort of the dark night of the soul. and things like that. I don't know, for whatever reason, now that I'm more aware of the contemplative and mystical traditions within Christianity, what I would describe all that as, and even that kind of like history of America, evangelical experience that Billy Graham, that everyone was going through, that's some sort of revival. It's real, whatever it is. And I think that wall that one hits it's very clear. It's the third stage of spirituality. It's somewhere between the third and the fifth mansion of the soul. Teresa talks about this, that one undergoes a complete change. And either at that point, you can work harder, white knuckle it, and fake it, as a lot of us did. I did that for a really long time, and it continues to erode. Or you can accept this kind of night of dark night of the soul and walk through this God that you can't hold on to. And that tends to be, if you look at so what, like as a cultural phenomenon, it was almost like everyone developed this it's very common, took on the first couple steps of the journey of faith. And then a lot of these traditions actually keep you in that third stage where you're very active. Your faith is extremely active. You're doing a lot for God. You do have great faith. But moving from there and moving away from our parents' faith, moving away from the faith that we grew up with, entering into closer to a God who isn't so clear any longer because he's actually more profound than we could have ever imagined. Moving from there to there is terrifying, and it will disconnect you from a lot of things. And that, I think, is what, at least existentially for me, what I had to walk through, that was very difficult to do. But it feels like as a cultural phenomenon, it was like we all hit a wall. And I saw a lot of my friends, like you say, a lot of people became, materialism just easier. It's just more simple. I don't know why there's evil. So I'm just not going to believe in God or something, whatever it is, that you kind of just get worn out. And there's a lot of other things I think going on, but it tracks very much with spiritual progress, where one gets around this third stage and there's no kind of way. It's a kind of a point of no return. Either you walk into the abyss and find God somehow mysteriously, or you would kind of go work harder or give up. There's a three option. Yeah.
Well, and I also noted in your conversation with Michael, the development of the active voice. And of course, I had to study Greek in terms of my seminary training. Your active voice, the passive voice, and of course, the Greek had the middle voice. And I really liked in that conversation how you mapped. Well, you didn't exactly. Well, I sort of mapped the active voice onto modernity, because the closing one eye, the reason you close one eye and you strip out the final purposes, and you break everything down into physics in terms of, okay, this is natural, this goes on its own. The reason you do that, and the reason you wade in with your own purpose, is in order to wield. And that
Yes,
is that
absolutely.
is modernity. That, and I think you said quite rightly in that conversation, none of us, we would be enormous hypocrites and ingrates to too quickly condemn that movement, because it has brought us vaccinations,
Yes.
clean water, transportation, Zoom. That movement, that movement has blessed us in many and deep ways. And I think, again, in terms of sort of trying to figure out the moral valence of this movement, this Barfieldian you movement, the descent into a divided, a loss of participation was the coming of our ability to wield, and in that sense, exhibit the kind of agency and stewardship that I think is inherent in the Genesis stories, for example, and the cultural mandate, as my tradition put it. But now, and I liked how you said, so modernity is sort of the active voice, post-modernity, the passive voice, where you find, you look around, at least in terms of woke, sort of the woke theology, none of us are actually agents. We are all sort of mimicking, the racism, the colonialism, the patriarchy, and even once I own my privilege and try to get in touch with my privilege, I still can't help but, we're extremely passive. And there are these, to map some New Testament, there are these principalities and powers of of racism and the patriarchy. There are these principality and powers that so completely consume us that, so now the passive, but now we get then into hopefully the middle voice. And I think this in some ways, and I think Michael will notice this maps onto some of Vervaeke's, Vervaeke's wrestling through the meaning crisis stuff, where you've got, you come from an Aristotelian world, which Lewis talks about in The Discarded Image, where, final cause just works all the way through the system. And then that world is lost. And so, the middle voice is where it's, now suddenly we're in participation with, we're co-creating, and I see sort of a continued movement through that. That's sort of a way that we can map our way through this. And this gets into some of this process, these levels of, I always get real nervous with, levels of spirituality, because whenever you introduce a schema like that to people who are fundamentally modern, we so want to wield it. And the point of this living God is that this isn't, you don't wield God. That's the first lesson against idolatry. You don't wield God, and you can't. But then the trust factor comes in with, but he has an invitation to conversation and co-creation with you, but he is not an equal partner with you. To the degree that he is condescending to you, because, and the ancients knew this, but modernists forget it. Until, of course, a virus comes up and suddenly we realize that, oh, this tiny little thing just brings our entire civilization to a halt, and we don't like it.
One of the interesting things that made me think while you're talking about, in terms of, modernity's use of the active and using this power to wield, it's interesting that, the main reason people seem to deconstruct this day, and this came up in Nathan Jacobs' documentary film, where he interviewed all those people that were the nuns, that they have no religion. Almost universally, it seemed to me, in my recollection, it was always theodicy, right? It was the problem of, I can't believe in God because of the evil in the world. And this didn't seem to be a problem for the ancients, even though by any, quantifiable measure of suffering, they had to have so much more of it on a daily basis. Like it was part and parcel of being for them. Whereas and somehow along this modern path, I guess we've now assumed that we could create a better reality. And so that's what this kind of simplistic, it's really easy. It's just science, it's math and science, and we get to the, utopia. It's really easy. And somehow we've just kind of missed a turn. And so it's like we need this sort of events like COVID or other things to kind of bring a humility back into the equation. I think part of what Barfield's doing with ideas like polarity and stuff is he's trying to reintroduce that complexity that flummoxes our formal logical systems. He's trying to get people to see that, so they can have a bit of that humility to understand why us writing the script isn't so good for us.
Well, I think we bump into that usually into one ways. COVID comes up and we realize, oh, we don't have that big of a grasp on reality. The other one that perpetually comes up is, well, let's say the 20th century. Oh, when we do, look what we do with it. because, and this sort of comes back to your community point, where, well, everybody longs for community. Why? Well, I thought you could make yourself happy with all of the wielding that you're doing, because what you bump into via community is actually a smaller scale, a smaller scale existential lesson that other people aren't, other people, you don't wield other people. I mean, as a pastor, the most common thing people come to me in terms of with suffering, if it's not medicine or finance or something like that, is these people that I live with, or these people I share a church with, they're resistant to my wielding. Oh, tell me about that. Tell me how you've tried. In fact, I've watched you try to control and manipulate and
Yeah.
so everyone's excited. And I think this is where, this is where the Pentecostalism expresses its modernity and also gets, becomes unreal, because we want to wield God. And, well, they go back to lesson 1, he will not be wielded. Idolatry. And number 2, we have to relate to God. Well, you're going to have to learn to trust. And trusting and wielding are sort of at two ends of the spectrum here. And I think, Michael, you're exactly right in terms of modernity. The problem of evil that you find in Job is different from the problem of evil that you find at the destruction of Lisbon, which seemed to be a really instrumental moment as in the Enlightenment, when we're sort of beginning to catch the vision of wielding. And then, well, if building the churches and praying and doing the worship service was supposed to somehow afford us a privileged position with God, why would God allow the earthquake and the tsunami to hit just at the moment that pious Lisbon was gathering for prayer? Perhaps it's all just a story, and in order to save ourselves, we need to lean heavily into the science and technology and get at the business of wielding. But then, of course, we're going to run right into other people. So Michael or Mike, now in terms of your journey, where has, this also gets into the symbolism, where has your, where has this bumped into? Now you're going to work with, a Dallas Willard organization. That's what I understood from there too.
Yeah, I work the Martin Institute at Westmont College. Yes.
Okay, because Willard is a very interesting person in terms of this whole trajectory. And there's recently been a biography out of Willard, which is very interesting because Lewis and Barfield sort of nicely embody this process at the beginning of the 20th century into the 20th century of dealing with sort of a meaning crisis. The World War I experience, which is sort of the height of modernity, the confrontation of, okay, once we wield, look at what we produce. Dallas Willard comes along at the end of the 20th century, studying Husserl, and an attempt sort of to reintegrate again, but not so much Pentecostal. If you read, let's say, his great, why can't I think of it? This book on the Sermon on the Mount, I've been through it. I don't know how many times. I can't think of the title. Come on, help me out here. The Dallas Willard's book on the Sermon on the Mount. Why can't I think of it? Anyway, but Willard comes along as a phenomenologist. And when you listen to Dallas Willard talk, he sometimes sounds Pentecostal because you really have a sense of participation with Dallas Willard. But he also brings in the and did more than many people in the 20th century to really bring to the church, he and Richard Foster, kind of these more ancient traditions, the Lectio Divina, the fasting. And when I look at, what's been happening, let's say with the new rise of orthodoxy in this space, it really is very Barfieldian in terms of trying to seek a new participation. So I don't know if you can, I mean, it's so interesting to me listening to you that suddenly Dallas Willard comes up and I thought, oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, I think that what appeals to me about what the Martin Institute is doing is precisely what you're talking about. On the one hand, it's reintroducing ancient spirituality, the disciplines, things like that. But what I think Dallas Willard did well and was a bit ahead of his time was that he really was marrying the head and heart, not in a not just glossing over it, but I think what is fundamental to his work is that he saw this developing in habits. And you can see this tracking with philosophy right now. Like, I won't get into it, but the idea of a return to habits of, how would I describe that? So oftentimes habit is the way of overcoming this heart mind division. And I think in the ancient tradition, this is very normal. But so most of my Christian life early on was going about a way of life that didn't align with my heart. So to be a Christian, I had to suppress certain things of my life that didn't, if I to be a Christian and to be a successful Christian meant that I would probably be quite miserable. I'd suppress certain things about me, and I didn't know how to align my own values and my own desires with God's. And then my way of life was robotic, almost this difference between internal and external. In habit, and what Dallas Willard was doing is he actually believed that people could be transformed, not just in a not just in the mind, not just in the heart, but their way of life, who they actually were, could be transformed. And I think that's where he was quite ahead of his time, if that makes sense. So that's where, for me, the Barfield stuff obviously doesn't come in with this, but the idea of living well and living a virtuous life, I think, is more important today than it's ever been. And I think someone like Willard was getting to this. I think he really was.
I think that Barfield stuff does come into this. Now, Barfield obviously isn't doing what Willard did in terms of, but I see that, I see Dallas Willard's project, especially in the Great Conspiracy, the Divine Conspiracy. There it is. Yep. The Divine Conspiracy. When you read Dallas Willard and his subsequent books, of course, I've read the Divine Conspiracy a number of times. I see Willard leaning into and seeking after a sort of final participation, and habit is, formation. I mean, of course, formation has become this huge buzzword now. Yeah. And again, you're working on this project with, have Jamie Smith and Jamie Smith, of course, in my corner of Christianity, brought forward the liturgies conversation and all of that language. Exactly. And I very much do see that as leaning into and looking towards, what Barfield was looking for in terms of final participation. And I also see that connecting up with, again, Lewis's vision of miracles in his book Miracles, in terms of miracles of the old creation and miracles of the new creation. I recently had a conversation with John Vervaeke and a J.P. Marceau, who was a student of Michael. You probably watched that conversation, didn't you? Mm-hmm. And and I said something to John Vervaeke that sort of took him back, because I said, well, I'm not entirely sure that walking on water isn't something that we were made for. And, that you say that, that you say something like that sort of disorients modernists because, oh, come on, I know physics. People don't walk on water. But Pentecostals wouldn't blink at that. Pentecostals, they're looking at, just about anything goes. And so you're trying to figure out how this comes together. But when I look at Dallas Willard, and especially some of the stories around Dallas Willard, that if you hang around with enough of his disciples, Dallas Willard had some spooky aspects to him that Pentecostals wouldn't necessarily be offended by. Modernists probably would, but Dallas is not some raging, mindless Pentecostal who is unaware of the history of philosophy, professor of philosophy at USC. So I very much see Willard in this movement, even if I haven't read a single citation of Owen Barfield in Dallas Willard. So I don't know, but he certainly read Lewis.
Yeah, just to clarify, what I didn't mean that I didn't see overlaps. I meant I don't normally talk about Barfield at my work. I don't really talk about him that often, to be honest. Most people are like, who's that? But anyway, that's all I meant. But yeah, I do agree there are overlaps there for sure. And you're tracking it very well. Yeah.
Well, I think Owen Barfield, what part of what he was doing and why I think he's been useful for me is he comes at this with completely different language, right? He kind of almost is just completely reinventing the wheel on his own, and in doing so, he kind of screws up a lot of things. He could have done a lot of it easier, but I don't know. For me, at least, there's something. I think a lot of times when I'm engaging with a thinker, some of what I'm doing, is sort of a sort of I don't know, rule of thumb for me. I'm more analyzing some level of consistency within their story that's telling me, are they a reliable witness to what they're talking about? And so because he's not borrowing from anybody else, he's talking about things he's thought through deeply on his own. That's always kind of shining forth in all his work, that you're like, I don't know if this guy's, crazy, but I know he's talking about something that's really personally meaningful to him. And he's doing it. He does it, most of that work, I'd say, outside the Christian frame. He does join the Anglican Church later, and not without some prodding from both his wife and Lewis to do so. But I mean, I think he definitely sees the incarnation as this pivotal thing in the history of humanity. But he's trying to. I think he kind of sees the church in some sense has failed in its duties to represent these things well. So he's like, I'm just going to go do it on my own. And so his language is kind of divorced from that larger Christian tradition, and makes it harder to reintegrate him with some of that. But I do think there is so much overlap, as you pointed out, Paul.
Oh, and I think Steiner, some of Barfield's impulses probably come from Steiner too, because Steiner also, there's a lot of people who, John Vervaeke is one of them. There's a lot of people who sort of either grew up in the church or saw enough of church and gave up on church as a project and said, okay, I'm gonna go and do this on my own. And then they go and kind of do it on their own, and you get some really interesting experiments out there, and you get a certain degree of, they get its own weirdness. But what you tend to lose out on then is sort of this cohesive community that the church provides, which not only is a community horizontally, where you can actually have large numbers of people who are sort of pulled together, at least by Jesus in one way or another, but also historically, where you can go through time. So you've got, my wife actually teaches at a public school in Sacramento that uses Waldorf methods. And so I bump into Steinerites all the time, but they're all sort of floating out there as, nerdy, weird individuals who have read this guy. And, other people out there, hear about Rudolf Steiner, say, well, Steiner, well, they're kind of doing stuff with motion and stuff with art. And of course, for Steiner, that comes together, and it's not disconnected with Barfield's project either.
No.
But it seems often that without Jesus and the church, you just sort of get free floaters out there in history, which, well, maybe you can kind of map them together if you want to, but they don't cohere like you will get via the church, even the fragmented church post-Reformation. Mike, have you read any Tom Holland?
No, I've not.
Okay, do you know who he is?
No.
Okay. Michael's smiling because it's like Vanderclay's pulling his threads together. He's pulling the free floaters together. Tom Holland is a Tom Holland. There's two Tom Hollands. One is the actor who played Spider-Man. That's not the one I'm talking about. This guy first came to some prominence when he wrote a book, Rubicon, which was sort of he's been writing. He started out writing popularized history, basically classical history. When he graduated from college, he wanted to write novels, and so he actually wrote some vampire novels. But then what was also really interested in history, and so started writing, so he'd write about the Roman Empire, but he'd write it in a way that, if you like Tom Clancy novels, you can read legitimate history about the Roman Empire and enjoy the drama of the classical period. He's been on an interesting trajectory lately because he sort of got into the eastern part of the Roman Empire, wrote a lot about them, wrote a lot about the Persians, because got kind of interested in, of course, the Greek, the Greek-Persian wars, and then the late Eastern Empire, and then wrote a book which got him into a lot of trouble with many Muslims, because he basically looked as a modern critical historian at the mythology, the founding story of Islam, and basically came to the conclusion that it's sort of like if Christianity, it's sort of like if the Gnostics won. Because it's all like the 2nd, 3rd century Gnostic gospels, and that sort of, and of course the Islamic world did not appreciate this book. And somebody comes to him and says, hey, pick on your own religion. And he has to pause. And he, of course, first 6 years was a good Anglican lad, and then learned about dinosaurs, and the whole Christian artifice just sort of collapsed. And so he, like many, deconstructed at a young age, and the churches out there, but he was pretty much a secularist. And so when this Muslim kind of put his finger and said, why don't you deconstruct your own religion? He starts, well, what is my religion? So then he starts going back and putting this thing together, and over the last few years has been migrating towards Christianity, realizing that you cannot understand the West without understanding Jesus and the Apostle Paul. But one of the things that he notes, that he gets into this Reformatio, this Reformation idea, that we talk about the Protestant Reformation, but if you look in the history of the church, you have all of these reformations going on. Okay. And in fact, one of the things, so when I first started reading Barfield and talking to Michael and, getting into Barfield, this movement from, let's call it naive participation, and I don't use naive pejoratively, but initial participation, and then this separation, this loss of participation. We sort of can track this in the West via, you can see clear movements of it in the Protestant Reformation, where faith becomes very psychological, moving from a deeply sacramental system in medieval Catholicism. And then faith becomes very psychological. And you really see a Barfieldian, we find these instantiations of the Barfieldian you happening again and again. It's not just one big one, it's all these little ones, and it sort of fractals out there. It's in people's lives. One of the things I noted when I first started reading Barfield and thinking about Barfield is that you find this in Jesus. You find this in the Hebrew prophets. And so Tom Holland sort of picks up on this and says, he sees it sort of as disenchantment, because that's been the, sort of after Weber and Durkheim, that's sort of the, and Charles Taylor, that's sort of the tradition, that the language we use to talk about it. But, when the Hebrew prophets say, these idols are gods of wood and stone, you get a sort of a loss of, you get a loss of participation there. And when Jesus comes along, and, I don't know why this just doesn't shine out in neon lights when, to many people, when Jesus says, probably because we're Protestants, well, it's not what goes into your mouth that makes you unclean. It's what's in your heart. It's like, I mean, to understand how that would have been heard in his time, it's just breathtaking. And so, and then again, in the late antiquity period, when Christianity is sort of inheriting the empire and all of the different streams that are going back and forth with there, and you're going into these pagan roots, these pagan lands, and you're cutting down these sacred trees and building a church out of it. And then, 18th and 19th century colonial missionaries going into Africa and Asia. And we find this Barfieldian pattern again and again in the Old Testament, in Christianity. And I think, looking really for this, this final participation. But again, we bump straight into the wielding aspect, I think, in modernity. I don't know if that makes sense to you, or if you find that to be credible. What do you think about that in terms of Barfield and the fractaling of this pattern?
Yeah, I think you can see this throughout history, like you said, and whether there's this kind of overarching narrative. I think people would agree there is a kind of overarching narrative. Someone like Taylor, again, or Weber, like you mentioned, the idea of disenchantment. But I think it also happens, like you said, in individual lives as well. Barfield's story is the Old Testament warning against idolatry is there because to him the participation is so strong. People are confusing the worship of the creature with the creator, so to speak. So it's so strong to see God in things that we forget that God is beyond things as well. And so he tends to think that that's how he reads that. But yeah, I think there's a lot to be said about that in our own individual lives. Like, how often do I make idols of things, whatever they are, and have to pull back and go, whoa, what's going on here? I think it's also like, I think it's both a collective thing. It's an individual, it can happen individually, and it can happen over a long historical period. But that's really, intuitive to point that out. I've never thought of that.
What do you think, Michael?
I think one of the things that's really interesting about Barfield is, again, his emphasis on language and the ways in which something that starts as a distinction in the mind can become so much more over time. And so that you have, again, that use pattern is playing out over and over and over in terms of, but it's often, we often inherit some of the disconnection from those that have gone before us. Like some of these distinctions, for instance, that Kant makes, he's kind of trailblazing a little bit to create these distinctions that now we almost can't see. We kind of live in them. And so I think one of the interesting things about that is just how important it is to think about the language we use and what it signifies, and maybe do a little bit deeper dive in terms of some of the roots of these things, to get the humility necessary to understand what it is we wield when we use these little things called words that have a life of their own.
Yeah. Well, and again, that gets into, when you say that, it brings me into word of faith, traditions, Pentecostalism, name it, claim it. these things sort of get dismissed in our culture and in Christian, circles like my own, and sometimes with good reason, but we're circling around the same trees here.
Well, I think, I mean, that's a great to make that connection, because in some sense that Jesus says, greater works than these you will do. And what does he mean by that? I mean, I don't, there's something there about that I think Jesus is explicit about, the ways in which there is real power and agency given to us. So in a certain sense, yeah, how do we live into that as well? Because whatever the contours are of the world, and however the plot is being written, I think God has the ultimate say, but in some sense there's real kind of like imprints that we're putting into how that takes shape. There's something real that we contribute. I think Lewis in his Weight of Glory essay does this really well, where he talks about the sort of lasting impact we have on other people, that we tend to think of all these, civilizations and languages and all these things as the everlasting thing. He says, well, maybe not. Maybe it's these human creatures that are the only immortals, and that what will be our kind of everlasting signature of what sort of life we lived is these little impressions we've left on all these people around us, and how that affects and points them towards their final version of their story.
Yeah. Well, I've pestered you guys for an hour and a half. I don't know if you want to pester me at all, or if there's things you wanted to talk about that we haven't talked about.
I'm enjoying the conversation. I'm happy with it going any direction. Yeah.
As I mean, anybody who's watched my channel knows that I'm not. I can fill time on YouTube like few others. So. I was just really struck. I haven't read your book. I read a couple of reviews, Mike. But I was really struck by your story, and I came into this YouTube space. I was a foreign missionary for a while. I've been a local church pastor of really a dying, declining church, as so many of them are, of mostly baby boomers, or older, my parents' generation. And I, came across the work of Jordan Peterson and was immediately fascinated by it, partly because of the question about how to bring the worlds together. And so Lewis's, the kinds of issues that Lewis writes about in his book Miracles were very much, I saw these as critical for. So I was born in the mid 60s, and so I'm just at the end of the baby boom, not quite young enough to be an Xer, so I'm just kind of on the cusp there. But these issues of we in terms of our public life, we are on this ball traveling around the sun in a world of physics, but human beings, this is where we get into the meaning crisis stuff, the Vervaeke stuff, but human beings are sort of this strange anomaly in the world, because everything else in the world just goes by physics, just goes by nature. It's just stuff mechanically playing out. There's no purpose to it. But here, human beings are these tiny little isolated balls of purpose. And then these two scientific things keep making progress. One is physics, in which the world is getting weirder and weirder. And Lewis writes about this in Nature, because he says, we would love to imagine that beneath us are just these tiny little atoms, these little substances, and we're just the ramping up of these substances. But the deeper physics goes, the weirder physics gets. And at the same time, we would like to imagine, in sort of the Enlightenment, we become these little islands of purpose. But now, as the one disenchantment sets in, and as brain science continues, we increasingly begin to realize, there's a lot of nature in us. And so we have social sciences and we have psychology. And so what if the dead outside is also inside? And what if our experience of agency and purpose and meaning and living is just illusion, and we're simply finally deeply mistaken robots? And so then I see Jordan Peterson coming in with his Jungian psychology, and of course Jung is another figure, a little, sort of a contemporary of Steiner, very much in that German romanticism tradition. And of course Peterson comes in with his mythos, and then of course I see some echoes between Peterson and C.S. Lewis, and I thought, well, that's interesting. But then I also see many people about the age of you two who suddenly, they had deconstructed, they had been fans of Sam Harris, they had sort of been enamored by a vision of, just like Michael said earlier, well, if it's all science and if good is obvious, let's just make the world good with science. And anybody who knows any history would say, yeah, visit the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, see how that goes. And but then this movement from there into orthodoxy, iconography, Jonathan Peugeot, an icon carver, sort of, ramps up in Jordan Peterson's wake. And it's like, something's going on here. And then hearing your story, and I don't know much about radical orthodoxy. A number of people have sort of pointed me in that, and but I haven't had really time to dig into it. So then your story came along. I thought, okay, this is, you might not be aware of Jordan Peterson or Tom Holland or John Vervaeke or Jonathan Peugeot, but these currents are going through the culture and patterns are becoming apparent. And of course, Michael to me was sort of the connection, because Michael found you and Michael had found me. So
I appreciate you all making these connections, because I feel like I'm a bit of a hermit and I don't actually know what's going on out there. And so I do see, my sense, are you familiar with the work of Hans Boersma? I would imagine, because he swims in those streams too. So Hans is, he's done a lot to kind of also from a theological world introduce this kind of vision. I suppose I would call it a vision to people that might be less familiar, and put it in a language that people can understand for the most part. Some of his books are obviously more dense than others, but I think he's for someone who's kind of wants to track theologically with what's taking place and how it maps onto the things that you're talking about. I think he would be a great person. But yeah, my sense is that Christians, if they're in Christian or not, there's a sense that like we've kind of reached this good post-truth era, these sorts of things. And people are like, well, we do make meaning out of a lot of things, and things are important. So how do we move ahead on the one hand without throwing the baby out with the bathwater, whether that be spiritually, or how do you construct a proper society, politics and all of this? I think that we're entering a sort of post-liberalism. And what I mean by that is not left-right. I just simply mean that the idea that the individual will triumph, or that the will of just simply people getting together and putting their desires together to come to a certain end that doesn't, like you say, actively working towards something. I think we're so, you can see this in what I mean by post-liberalism is the idea that there's a sort of return to virtue, and that might have been important. I mean, McIntyre was already on to this, but I know that Peterson says stuff like, I don't know a lot about Jordan Peterson either. I mean, I feel like I'm going to get stoned for saying that. I'm just admitting that I'm naive. But yeah, so this return to virtue, I think, is quite important in this Aristotelian worldview as well, which, like you talked about, things actually are imbued with meaning, and that's how we recognize them. That's how we understand things to be good or not so good, or an ideal. We seem to be able to recognize these things, and are they inherent within things, and therefore, is there a certain end humans then should be striving towards? Is it just liberalism where no, it's just whatever the individual will desires, and we remove as many restrictions as possible, and one will become free, right? That's the notion of freedom we have today, where for Aristotle, that would be utterly foreign. You couldn't become free without restrictions. Like you have to have, like you said, within a community, you can't have proper relations unless you're able to limit your freedoms, right? And so I think these things are quite important today as we're considering like how, in a kind of a post-truth, post-metaphysical era. I think we're seeing a return even in philosophy and theology of metaphysics that these things are important. Of course, not in Enlightenment terms where they're highly rationalistic. That's not the case.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Well, and I think part of what's difficult is that the communities are, as always, disconnected, and that as a pastor, I mean, I keep trying to emphasize to people, I am a pastor, and my interest in this is pastoral, because even though you've got, radical orthodoxy, and, Jamie Smith has sort of become a popularizer of some of this, but I've seen him mostly popularize some of this sort of in middle brow, Calvin College graduate type spaces, whereas, someone like Jordan Peterson really penetrated deeply into far broader cultural realms. And yeah, there was a fair amount of culture war confetti flying around in that space. But what's going on underneath is of a whole with this broad movement in Western thought and practice that we've all been a part of to whatever degree we're conscious of it. And Michael and I found each other via the Jordan Peterson stuff, because that sort of went off sort of like a bomb, and a lot of people paid attention.
One thing you said that was interesting there, Mike, was connecting this all back to virtue. I found that really interesting, because I think that is something of definitely of what Jordan has kind of, there's definitely was a void there that he stepped into. And if you look at kind of his journey autobiographically, one of the things that he refers to is like, at some point in his life, he decided that he was going to make this really determined effort to tell the truth. And as soon as he started doing that, he really noticed how much of what he was saying was just a lie, like things either he didn't believe or like, and so that became kind of like this sort of thing where I think he was really smart. He went to one of the best schools in Canada, and then he was taught at Harvard. And so like I think he learned a certain humility towards that was so contrary to the modern, optimism about our ability to know and understand ourselves, which I think, if you're a smart person, you can think in terms of that modern framework. I'm smarter than most people, so I can kind of really use this as a sort of shortcut to understand and succeed in the world. And he comes at this completely different angle, which is like actually really a mystery to ourselves. And one of the best things you can do is just these sort of old wisdom traditions and these virtues, like telling the truth. They're just your best bet. They're not necessarily going to lead you to even to the promised land, but they're your best bet to not become a sucker for the complications of the world. The world is way, way more sophisticated than we tend to give it. We tend to conceive of it with our models of the world in the current frame. And so these virtues are things that you can use as kind of a rule of thumb, that there's nothing really better than you can do to live a meaningful life.
Well, and I see that coming through with Dallas Willard as well. Again, when I started making videos, commentary videos about Peterson's work, Lewis and Willard, I found very much at hand. Willard has there's a Veritas Forum video out there of Dallas Willard where he talks about how disenchantment is subtly socially enforced through status on a secular university campus. And of course, Willard would have known this firsthand because that's the milieu in which he's working. But he talks about basically how, if you're a young person walking on campus and you, the language is manicured and curated socially through status hierarchies on a campus. If you're heading into a PhD philosophy program and you're a raging Pentecostal who is trying to prove that Frank Peretti is the mythology of our time, it's gonna be interesting. And so, but these, and again, it's sort of like Chuck Colson coming home and say, I found Jesus, we're going to be Christians. Aren't we Episcopalians? Where are these things? How are these things sussing out between us? So I see these things very much alive in our culture right now. And as a pastor, I'm very interested in both how these things play out in the lives of not just people who, can go to university and get advanced degrees, but how these things play out in the lives and local church institutions of the vast majority of people that we are sharing this planet with, at least in this Western frame. So I find this stuff tremendously interesting. And Mike, my sense is that there are readers and there are listeners, and usually people who manage to get a PhD are readers. But if you've got a long road trip ahead of you, Michael can hook you up with all sorts of listening if your wife can tolerate it.
Yeah, that's a good point. I never thought of it that way. I think I am a reader and not normally a listener, but I need to. I remember when I was doing my PhD, I would listen all the time because I had like a 45-minute walk to campus and it was so fruitful. Now I feel like I don't have I don't know. But yeah, I have the space to do it, and especially the last couple of weeks, but I will certainly. Yeah. I really am seeing this kind of thing around me too. I wonder. I know we're probably not supposed to ask interviewers questions, but
oh, go ahead. My conversations, you wouldn't believe what happens.
As a pastor, like, what have you found to be the most, I suppose, fruitful for people who are wrestling with these sorts of things, or are in moments of crisis, or on the one hand, you said a lot of these are relational, but how have you found, what type of things have you found, or habits, or have been most fruitful for them in healing, or whatever, however you would describe that, or seeing again, we might say, or being, I don't know, revived?
It sounds cliche, but if I remember talking to a friend of mine who was he had grown up in a deeply dysfunctional home. His father was an alcoholic, verbally, physically abusive, parents divorced. Like many people who grew up in situations like that, eventually sought a degree in psychology because he's trying to sort himself out.
Yeah.
And, I was thinking this morning, I'll talk to Rebel Wisdom later today, but Bessel van de Kolk is a Dutch, he was someone who worked a lot on trauma. And he wrote a very interesting book called The Body Keeps the Score.
Yeah, my wife loves that book. She's all into that. Yep.
Yeah.
Incredible.
And I remember my friend saying, he said, he was using it in terms of the brain because that's sort of the materialist framing. But people have an amazing capacity to sort of intuitively either seek their own distraction or seek their own healing. And I think Freud stumbled onto this with the talking cure. In pastoral ministry, as I was, you don't learn pastoral ministry at seminary. You learn theology at seminary. You learn pastoral ministry when you're doing it. And I find that, sort of what I've practiced on my channel and really have to get back to, I haven't had a lot of conversations lately, but people need to talk, and someone needs to listen, and someone needs to care. I mean, just those very basic things are sort of the foundations. And so often when you find people who, and I think I can sense with each of us here, the church has afforded this. If you grew up in a household where, maybe mom and dad stayed together and, their marriage wasn't perfect, but they worked on it. And the kids, there was food in the refrigerator, and, parents went to PTA meetings, and, and usually churches both reinforce this and also demand it, which is one way of reinforcing, and if you grow up in that milieu, there's attachment and there's caring and there's listening and there's commitment. That's what human beings need. And you find people who, for no fault of their own, did not have that growing up. The way back involves, it's all the, I remember reading through, Paul's list of what he wants church leaders to be in the book of Timothy, and thinking one day, boy, these are shopkeeper virtues. Show up on time, listen, care. Do they need food? Give them something to eat. And just start with these things that even people who are tremendously dysfunctional or have significant mental illness or substance abuse. My father was a minister as well, and went to Paterson, New Jersey, growing up in the Midwest during the Depression and then World War II, and then came to Paterson, New Jersey in 1960. Didn't know anything about African American communities or cities or anything. Had never lived any of that, but had all of these virtues and could listen to people and care about people and commit to people. And so as a pastor, I look at all of this, and I love the philosophy and the ideas and the language. Of course, I love that. I wouldn't be talking to you guys. But what does the world need? It needs, it needs churches where, there's maybe not a lot of people, maybe not a lot of come, maybe the sermon's a little wonky and maybe the music's a little lousy, and maybe, there's a million things wrong with it, why it isn't setting the world on fire and becoming a mega church. But what you find there are people who are stable and listen and care. And so when what does the world need? It needs a lot of those little communities. And none of them are perfect. And they might have weird theology and, all kinds of crazy Frank Peretti stuff, or maybe all kinds of boring modernistic stuff. But they know how to love people and to stick with them and to not freak out when someone says the wrong things or goes on a bender or, starts camping outside your door all the time. And so, be patient. And again, once you get into these spirituality traditions, you begin to learn, oh, well, that's not that different.
Yeah. I think that's beautiful. It's beautiful.
So that's, and in our little corner of the internet, as John Vervaeke calls it sometimes, we have a Discord server. And so part of my focus as a pastor has been, well, let's bring people together. And, one of the things, so I made a video about Jordan Peterson and a lot of people watched it. And then, so now let's start a meetup. Okay. So then we, for twice a month or so, we all get in a room and we talk, and we'll talk about anything, but it's the showing up again. and caring. And, anybody almost anywhere in the world knows these virtues, but they are foundational to building anything larger. And they are too often despised, especially in a modernistic frame where it's all about wielding. Well, let's bring in a professional. Well, why don't you just bring in someone who cares and can listen?
Yeah.
So
Yeah, I've often thought that to be a Christian, I have to become more human. The longer I live, that's what it means, is becoming more in touch with who I am, my nature, the good, the bad, the ugly. So of course, self examination is so important, but it's by that we're able to be Christian. I think, at least me, I can say that my Christianity became very unhuman in the sense that it was just a bunch of beliefs, but that there's a reason Jesus was a human as well. And I think I so often forget that. Like, what are you feeling? There's pain there? Well, let's talk about it. Not let's just cover it up. Like you say, even the body tells us a lot about God, about who we are. So yeah, what you're saying is a good reminder of, and that resonates with us, right? Like my dad was just telling me the other day that he went and gave, for Veterans Day, they went out and handed out meals, and you could tell how much it resonated with him just doing that. Our body, they tell our human nature. And so in a, like Ronners calls it, anonymous Christians, we're all kind of anonymous Christians in our nature, being drawn to God. If we would just simply attend to who we are.
Yep. And I think men have a harder time with that than women sometimes, because women biologically, if in fact they become mothers, many of these virtues just, if you love that child will not survive unless you develop these virtues. Now, fathering is a step disconnected, but so yeah, that's what I see. It's on one hand, it's not, it's not mysterious or esoteric, but it is hard because people are messy and boring and chaotic and dangerous. But to actually hold on to them and work with them, there's real fruit there. And if these things aren't attended to, then you have real problems. So I don't know, is that a good place to land the plane here? Oh, I can't hear you, Michael.
Yeah, sorry, double mute. Yeah, I think that's good. I really like the, because it's funny in my own personal journey, all these ideas and the philosophy and all those things, they certainly were signposts, but yeah, it was the conversations with people who listened, and even watching some of your conversations with other people, and the ways in which you listened to them, and the way that drew some of their humanity out, that really was impactful for me over the years of my own transformation.
Well, I want to thank you both for giving of your time. And I know Mike is he's on a journey, almost literally, and we talked about that before we started recording. He had to fix a travel trailer or something. He's on his way across the country. And
yeah, I hope I'm halfway coherent right now. But
I hope you don't run into, because you're not heading south, you're heading north. And this time of year,
so we're actually going to go south first before we go west because of the climate. Yeah. So that's the plan anyway. We'll see if we make it.
Well, God's blessings on your trip.
Thank you.
I hope it to me it has the potential to be the kind of thing for you and your wife that is something that you're building memories out of. So,
Yeah, we're telling each other it's our 15th anniversary wedding gift. So we're almost done, and so it should be fun. It'll be fun.
wonderful, wonderful. So thank you both, and thanks for coming in for the conversation. I'm sure I'll post this sometime later this week. And God's blessings to you, Mike, with your work with the Martin Institute. And I hope that that sounds exciting. I think Dallas Willard is, one of the more important Christian voices of the last generation. And I'm glad to see that there's an institution coming around it to continue to develop and perpetuate it. So,
Well, thank you. Yeah, I'm excited with the work we're doing there.
Good. All right.
And thanks for this opportunity. It's been great. Great to get to know you. And I have good friends in Sacramento. If you're in Sacramento, is that right?
Yeah.
In fact, Eric Lee, the one I connected Michael to via email, he's a series editor for where my book came out in. He did his PhD with me at Nottingham, and he's just a saint. Him and his wife live in Sacramento.
Really?
So we might actually swing through there. We're planning on it. So if we do, I'll let you know.
Yeah, please do. Please let me know. I'd love to have coffee with you, depending on what time of the week, and it'd be fun to meet you and your wife. So that'd be great.
That'd be great.
All right. Well, have a great
much.
trip, and thank you, Michael. I don't know why Karen doesn't have more subs, because your conversations with Karen, I think they're just beautiful. So.
Yeah, Michael is very good at this. I've told him that. He's very articulate, very intuitive, very good at interviewing and connecting the dots in great ways. So you might have a future in this. Both of you seem to be very good at this.
Thanks.
All right. Thank you both. Take care.
All right. Thank you.
Bye-bye.